We'll probably go for about 45 minutes to 50 minutes. And then afterwards, if you want to chat, I'd be happy to chat one-on-one, or if you have questions you want to ask, I'd be happy to take questions as well. So I'm going to very quickly go through what takes me about 16 weeks to cover at Arizona State University, and I'll give you a quick introduction when Arizona was Spanish territory. Now, this map that I have here just shows you the various exploratory missions and expeditions that went through what is North America, or what we characterize now as the United States. Some of them, of course, as you see, the dark one, the very black one, that's the Lewis and Clark expedition. This map is simply trying to show you the various routes as explorers went through what is now the United States. What I want to point out to you are two, and let me just reach over here for this one. So, this is the course of the expedition which comes up through Arizona, 1540, 1542. The second one is the Escalante Lomitas exploration that goes through northern Arizona as well. So I share that with you in terms of the earliest moments that we know of Spanish presence in Arizona was really in this effort to explore and discover the civilizations that lived up in this area. Oh, sorry, wrong direction. Now, let me start with the earliest Spanish presence in what is now Arizona. So, to remind you very quickly, when did Columbus sail the ocean blue? What year was this? 1492, very good, okay. Now, this is really going to test you. When did Hernán Cortés lead the Spanish expedition into what is now Mexico? Does anyone know?
1515?
15, no, it wasn't 1510, it's very close. 1519 to 1521. This is known as the conquest of Mexico, right? When Cortés and his allies then overthrew the Mexica Empire, the Aztec Empire as well. Now, here's why I'm telling you this, 1521. 5 years later, there is an expedition that is sent to, now there are various accounts about their destination, but they left Cuba, as you see down to the right of your screen, and they sailed up to the Florida area. This is the Narvaez expedition, so 1527. And I find it very interesting, within 5 years, 6 years of the establishing the Spanish presence in Mexico, they're sending then expeditions to explore other parts of the Americas. So they go up to Florida, and again, I'll try and make the long story very short, but it's a very fascinating story at the same time. They make landfall, this expedition, with probably about 600 soldiers and sailors, and some wives as well. So the ground troops make landfall, and this is a picture of Narvaez right there. They make landfall about mid-peninsula, and the idea was they were going to travel overland while the ships were going to follow along the sea, and they were going to meet up at a particular place. So as the expedition traveled up north overland, they encountered resistance after resistance after resistance. The natives of the Florida area fought. There were difficulties as well. When they arrived, the ground troops, when they arrived at the preordained spot, the ships were nowhere to be found. So this then presented an enormous problem, as you can imagine. The idea then came up was that they were going to build their ships, and they were going to then sail from about the Panhandle area, and they were going to sail across the Gulf of Mexico down to Veracruz. This was the plan. So they built their ships, but what they did not know is what we're facing right now is that there is such a thing as hurricane season. So as they launched out into their rafts, they were blown back and swamped as well. Those that survived, there were about 80 left. And so they decided that that was not possible. They decided to travel overland, to walk around the coast to get down to Veracruz. When the journey ended, there were 4 left, and it took them about 9 years. Now, you may have heard the name Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, right? Cabeza de Vaca was among the few survivors that traveled overland. In fact, this route now, you see the solid orange line, that is an estimated route. We don't know. But I'll tell you the reason why I'm telling this story in just a moment. You see that they appear to have crossed through parts of Arizona, and they finally made it down to Culiacan, where they then encountered Spanish slave traders, and then took them. And it's an interesting story because Cabeza de Vaca wrote his account, you can read about it. You can imagine for traveling for 9 years, their beards, they looked like Gandalf, right? Their beards were down to their ankles practically, and it took a while for the Spaniards that were out, that were enslaving various tribes to even register that these were fellow Europeans. But nonetheless, they made it back down. Now, one of the other survivors was a Moorish slave. In other words, he was from North Africa, and his name was Estebanico, or Esteban de Torrantes, or a number of names that we know him by. Here's why this all becomes important. As they're traveling overland, and they survived in any way possible, at times they were enslaved, at times they were traders, at times they were healers, they gathered information about the tribes in the interior of the continent. And one of the most important accounts that they heard multiple times was the story of the 7 cities of Siwana, right? The cities of Siwana. You remember about this, right? I mean, for those of you who know your Arizona history, these were cities that were described to be paved as gold. And as a matter of fact, the various accounts, it wasn't just one tribe that told the account. These were stories told throughout the West, the various peoples they encountered, was that Siwana was a city that was even grander than Tenochtitlan, which is now modern-day Mexico City. Now, Tenochtitlan, just to give you some idea, when Cortez and his soldiers, they landed in Veracruz, and then they headed out west. And as they entered the mountains that then overlooked the Valley of Mexico, the soldiers that were with Cortez, they looked at each other and they said, "Are we dreaming?" I mean, the city of Tenochtitlan just gleamed. It was beautiful. There were canals. It looked like Venice to many of these seasoned travelers, these seasoned soldiers. They could not believe what they were seeing. So now imagine in Spanish years, suddenly the report comes back that up north is a city that's even grander than Tenochtitlan. It's even wealthier than Tenochtitlan, which again was the capital of the Aztec Empire, which is now Mexico City. This is what galvanized and explorers, and now we're talking about Coronado, the Coronado expedition. This is what galvanized explorers to then gather together troops, personnel. The Coronado expedition was about 2,000. If you think about this, now they weren't all Spaniards, many of them were native allies, and they traveled northward to find the cities of Siwana. Who went with them as a guide? It was Estebanico. This is why I'm telling you this story, right? He had traveled this land, he was familiar with it, knew the geography. Most importantly, he knew where the water was and where the fields were that they could feed their horses and so forth. So Estebanico went along as the guide. With him was a friar by the name of Marcos de Niza. Right? Now this is a name that we're also familiar with here in the Valley. High school, probably the reason why. But Marcos de Niza went along with Estebanico as his guide. They were perhaps a week in advance, and they would send back reports on a regular basis. There is water to be found here, there's grass to be found here. And so they made their way northward up into what we believe is Arizona. Now, oh, sorry, this is the old map that I'm showing you with. All right, so this is the Coronado expedition. All of this I told you as well. This is a famous painting by Frederick Remington. I'm sure many of you have seen that, just to illustrate what that expedition was. And one of the reasons I wanted to share that with you is it's really not so much who's in focus, but if you notice in the background, you get this sense of a very, very large party. And that's what I want you to understand, that this was a very, very large party. So of course they needed to know where the water was and where the grass was, where they could get food, where they could replenish themselves, even where the villages were that were growing beans and squash and things that they needed as they traveled along. So let me finish off the story of the Coronado expedition. So I don't have a map of that, I apologize, but let me go back to this and I'll share this with you. There we go. There we go. And I hope you can hear me as well, let me just do this, let me just point. So you see the border of New Mexico and Arizona, and you see how the expedition went up. Now this is showing you the Cabeza de Vaca expedition as they went around and went south. But the Coronado expedition followed pretty much this westerly route and went up north. They continued up along the New Mexico-Arizona border and wound up in a Zuni village, which is known as Hawiku. So that Zuni village is found up there, again, in northern Arizona, the Arizona-New Mexico area as well. Hawiku was, of course, a large settlement. It was made of adobe, and you've seen many of the Pueblo dwellings in the American Southwest, but it was not paved with gold. And at that point, the Coronado expedition had enough. They wanted to take the friar's life, but cooler heads intervened. He was sent back in disgrace back to Mexico. But Coronado continued on. As a matter of fact, his expedition, as far as historians can trace, made it all the way into Kansas in an effort to find Siwa. So when they finally realized it's nowhere to be found, they turned around and came back. So this whole expedition was about 3 years, 2.5 years, 3 years as well. So this is, again, I share this with you about the earliest Spanish explorations into Arizona. Now, with that, let me show you this map, and then I'll come back to that previous picture. This map is a picture of the Spanish missions that were in, and some of them still are in, what is present-day United States. So you'll see very clearly to the left of the screen, all the way from San Francisco Solano, this is San Francisco, all the way to San Diego de Alcalá, right, San Diego. This is known as El Camino Real if you go to California, right? This is the route that traced the missions all together. Move over into what is now Arizona, San Javier del Bac. There were some other missions that were attempted in Yuma as well, and also in Tumbucacari. They were attempted, but they didn't succeed. Why did they not succeed? It was largely because Arizona was populated with highly motivated tribal nations that were organized and very resistant to Spanish colonization. So essentially, the Spanish presence really never made it further north than the Gila River, pretty much, into Arizona. But let me just follow it through so you understand as well. So you'll see up into New Mexico as well, the missions over there, all the way into El Paso. El Paso is, for some reason, there's not a mission in this map. But here's what I want to understand. Spain claimed this entire area. They claimed it as part of their global empire. But part of the way that missions worked was that there was a mission that was established, so it was a religious institution. There was a chapel built, and then right next to the mission was a presidio. It was a military garrison. Now the military garrisons often numbered no more than about a dozen. So you have about a dozen Spanish soldiers who are there to protect the mission. Here's what I want you to understand though. The reach of the mission and the reach of the garrison was probably no more than about a mile, if you will. So all of the land inland, so just imagine everything east of, say, San Antonio de Padua or Santa Barbara, everything east, going into Arizona, going into Nevada, all those, this is all native country. This is all Indian country, and it is very well protected. As I mentioned before, there were efforts in Yuma to establish a mission there. It was destroyed because, again, the native communities organized together, fought together, overthrew the Spanish that were there. In fact, in Tumbucacari, you can still go there to this day, which is south of Tucson, and it is now a national monument. There is a failed mission. You can actually see the old chapel there and some of the mission walls as well. It failed, again, because of the Yaqui and the Apache and the Navajo were so successful in expelling the Spanish presence. So I want you to understand that even though we look at this, I don't want you to look at that and think, oh, well, this is all Spanish America. No, Spain actually only had claim on footholds in various places, but all of that land in the interior, that's all native country. That's all native country. That's important for you to understand. Now, let's move forward. So the United States, let me back up. So Mexico declares its independence from Spain. New Spain declares its independence from Spain, and they proclaim their name as Mexico. So that begins in 1810 and finishes by 1821. We could go into some of that story if you'd like to, and the Q&A, I'll be happy to try and go into a little more detail. But I want you to understand 1821. Two things I want you to understand about this. When Mexico established itself as a republic, they were bankrupt after about a decade of fighting to begin with. They're absolutely bankrupt. In addition, all the colonial administrators who had expertise in all the necessary skills of overseeing a large empire, they were sent packing back to Spain. So what that meant was that there was a brain drain, if you will, in the New Republic, and there was a literal financial drain. They were poor. This is one of the reasons then why the peace that Spain was able to establish with these raiding native communities, in other words, they bought peace, right? It was gone. Mexico could not afford to continue buying peace from the native communities. And then the West exploded. Raiding communities started doing their historic and cultural activities in raiding to be able to feed themselves. What Mexico does then is that they then realize, first of all, it's difficult to recruit people to go up north and to settle into the area that was known as La Frontera, the frontier, because you could die if you did that. It was very, very difficult to induce settlers to do that. So what is the New Republic going to do? There were some administrators who realized, you know what, there are a lot of Americans that would love to settle in this area. Let's welcome them into our northern provinces if they promise to do two things. One, convert to Roman Catholicism, and two, swear loyalty to the Republic of Mexico. So Moses Austin, for example, moves into Texas. And this is where Americans start to pour into Texas, and you hopefully remember what happens after that point, the Alamo and all of that, right? But other Americans began to come into the United States before the United States actually goes to war with Mexico. So I want you to understand that there were pockets of Americans here and there in what is now the American West, even though at that time it was part of the Republic of Mexico. Now, the United States goes to war with the Republic of Mexico in 1846. It ends by 1848. And what the United States claims then are the northern provinces, La Frontera, of the Republic of Mexico, which, as we understand now, is everywhere from California all the way to Texas and up north, right? This is how then Arizona becomes part of American territory. So this is an actual picture of American settlement in what is now downtown Phoenix. Imagine how lucky you would be able to claim a parcel of land in downtown Phoenix. Now, what we're seeing here, there are a couple things I want to point out. One, this is a wheelwright shop. So this is where you would go. This is a garage, basically, right? This is where you would take your wagon to get fixed, and you can see some wagons out front. The buildings are made of adobe. Of course, it made perfect sense before the days of air conditioning. You want that kind of protection, and the buildings are also flat roofed. Earliest Phoenix looked like this. It was an accumulation of adobe villages. Here's what I want you to understand, though, was that when Phoenix first existed, the earliest census that we have in the United States was 1870. There were about 250 settlers. Half of them were from Mexico. And about another third were the native communities, the Hashido Bipash, for example, the Maricopa, and the Akimilwatam, the Papago, if I remember it correctly. So Phoenix first begins, and the rest were basically American expatriates, Civil War veterans. So when Phoenix first begins as a city, it is highly interracial, and it is bilingual as well. The first newspapers in Phoenix, as well as the first school curriculum in Phoenix, they were in Spanish, and it was bilingual as well. So this is really the history and the heritage of Phoenix. Forgive me for just observing for just a moment. I don't know that we remember that, collectively speaking, but it's important for us to ground this. Now, that's a very, very quick overview of Hispanic America, if you will. This is where Latter-day Saints start to come into the picture. And this is one of the points I want you to understand, is that Spanish-speaking Latter-day Saint missionaries were at the forefront and advanced the LDS settlement into Arizona. Now, the first settlements in Arizona began in 1877, but missionaries that were called to Mexico, Spanish-speaking Mexico, began in 1874, 1875. So they predate the Latter-day Saint settlements in Arizona. Here's the other thing I want you to keep in mind here. This is a map of the Mormon Battalion. Start in 1846, they end up in 1847. They travel over 2,100 miles from Council Bluffs, Iowa, all the way down to San Diego as well. The Mormon Battalion, if you don't know this, they were about 550 strong. The numbers varied over time, led by Colonel Stephen Kearney as well. they were drafted on the part of the American military because of fear that the Mormons would be loyal to Mexico and not the United States. So let me explain what I mean by that for just a moment. When the Latter-day Saints left Nauvoo, Illinois, and they crossed the Mississippi, they headed out west, they were headed to Mexico. That was their destination. In many ways, they were following the steps of Moses Austin and some of the other Americans as well. Where the Latter-day Saints were different, though, was that their destination was not in the kind of population centers of the American West. They wanted to pick a far-flung corner of the Mexican Empire where they could be left alone. And this is why their eyes were set on the Great Salt Lake area, right? Now, as they are traveling, the earliest parties, advanced parties of Brigham Young, as well as they leave Nauvoo and they're heading out west, war breaks out in Mexico. So by the time that the Latter-day Saints, that the first wave enters into the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, Utah is now part of the United States. So I want you to understand this. So the Latter-day Saints left the United States, headed towards Mexico, but when they arrived in what they believed, or they thought was going to be Mexico, was now part of the United States. Now, in that process, though, the United States government was heavily fearful that these Latter-day Saints, who were leaving because of the religious persecution, would throw their weight behind the Mexican Republic and not the United States. That's why that the U.S. military sent representatives out to intercept the Latter-day Saints at Council Bluffs, talk them into being part of this expedition that would travel through the American Southwest as part of the larger American effort to claim this part of land that was at one time Mexico. So that's what I want you to understand by this map. But something more significant happens, is that members of the Mormon battalion, many of them learned Spanish. And those that learned Spanish, they became critical scouts, leaders in Arizona, the Arizona settlements, and translators of the Book of Mormon and other religious texts as well. Let me tell you in particular one gentleman that I fear that we have not remembered, collectively we've not remembered. This Daniel Webster Jones. Daniel Webster Jones is buried in the Mesa Cemetery. Daniel Webster Jones was the founder of Lehigh, Arizona, but before that, Daniel Webster Jones left home, I believe he was about 14 years of age. He ran away from home. He was not a member of the church, by the way. So he ran away from home, joined the army, was part of the invasion of Mexico as well. And while he was there, gained a great love for the Mexican people. And in fact, he stayed. When the war was over, he stayed. And he became very fluent in Spanish. Daniel Webster Jones was the first person tasked by Brigham Young to begin translating the Book of Mormon into Spanish. In fact, let me tell you this. I skipped over a little piece as well. So Daniel Webster Jones, let me back up. So he's in Mexico. The war's over. He gains a great love of Mexican culture, Mexican cuisine, of Spanish as well. So he's living down there. He picks up with a party of traders who then are heading up north, and he decides to travel with them as well. And they're heading up north, and they go into the Utah territory. And at one point, this is very common in the Old West. As you can imagine, holsters, leather holsters were expensive. And often people who are traveling, outdoors people, they don't have a lot of money. So what was very common is that people would just put their pistol into their pants, right? They just put it down. So it was one of those times that Daniel Webster they were traveling along, he put his pistol in his pants and it went off. And he got shot in kind of in the thigh area. And the wound was grave enough. In fact, it's described as like a 14-inch wound. It was grave enough that his companions couldn't treat it. But they knew that down the road was a settlement, a Mormon settlement called Provo, that they decided to take Daniel Webster Jones to so that he could get healed, and then they left. So Daniel Webster Jones now finds himself in this strange settlement of other Americans in Provo. And that is when he begins to learn about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and about the restored gospel as well. Not only does he convert, but he also marries the daughter of the gentleman that he was staying with. And then he becomes a member of the church. And then this is one of the reasons why Brigham Young then asks Daniel Webster Jones to begin the project of translating the Book of Mormon into Spanish. Let me just add one other story. And forgive me, I hope this isn't going too deep into the weeds, but it's such a fascinating story. So Daniel Webster Jones, he is fluent in Spanish. And so for those of you who have learned Spanish, it's one thing to be conversant in Spanish. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can read and write well. Am I right, my mother? Yes? All right. My mother teaches Spanish as well, the grammar, the whole thing, right? So you can be fluent, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, that you are an expert in translating. And Daniel Webster Jones felt at a loss and told this to Brigham Young. Brigham Young said, the Lord will provide. Daniel Webster Jones is fasting and praying, what do I do? Along comes another gentleman by the name of Melitón Trejo. Melitón Trejo who was actually an instructor of Spanish. He actually came to Utah from the Philippines. At the time, he was stationed in the Philippines as an officer. And as he was serving out his commission, he confided to a fellow officer kind of his religious views. And he was waiting for a restoration of the pureness of the gospel of Jesus Christ as described in the Bible. And one of his companions said, you know what, you sound like a Mormon. You should check them out. Well, the thought began to germinate in the mind of Melitón Trejo. He found a newspaper article that described the settlement of the Latter-day Saints in Utah, and he resigned his commission, and he then boarded a ship, traveled all the way to the Philippines, all the way into the Utah territory, and said, I'd like to learn more. And as you can imagine, he was highly welcomed. And after that point, Melitón Trejo then learns about this effort to translate the Book of Mormon into Spanish, and lo and behold, then becomes someone who has the expertise to be able to translate. So together, these two, there are a few others as well, they began translating sections of the Book of Mormon, not the entirety. The plan was to translate about 100 pages, selections, that then missionaries could use. So that translation begins in 1874. Jones then leads the mission of missionaries who are called into Mexico. And there were, perhaps 7 or 8 different missionaries who were called into Mexico. And here's what they did. Here we go. In 1875, this group of missionaries, they depart the Utah territory. Now, I don't have a map here, but you'll see Phoenix. I should have a map that goes all the way up in Utah. But they start up in Draper, and they move down through Panguitch, and they're traveling, as you can imagine, at a fairly slow pace. They have wagons, they have horses. It's not anything like we're accustomed to today, where you hop in your car and 6 hours later you're at Hermosillo or somewhere, right? It's very, very different. So it took a long time as they traveled. But here's my point, right? This is what I want you to understand. They depart the Utah territory in 1875. They're traveling down through Arizona, and all throughout they stop and they preach and they baptize. So they stop in Flagstaff, they stop in Prescott, they stop in Phoenix, they stop in Tempe, they stop in Tucson. So some of the earliest baptisms of Spanish-speaking members trace to this journey even before they get down into Mexico. Now, the other thing that Brigham Young tasked them to do, particularly Daniel Webster Jones, he's an explorer. One of the things that Brigham Young asked him to do was to be mindful of areas that were good for settlement, and to send back information about different areas where the Latter-day Saints could expand, because of course the Utah Valley was not large enough to hold all the saints that were coming in from Europe, but also continued to come over from the Midwest as well. So Daniel Webster Jones and his companions are sending back reports all the time. There's water here, there are open fields here, so forth and so on. So this knowledge then predates and sets up the Latter-day Saint colonization of Arizona. So let me continue on about this journey. So they enter into Mexico in 1876. At that point, they break up and go into different areas, different towns. Some of them go into El Paso, some of them go into various parts. The first baptisms occur in Mexico in 1877. And I want to share with you a story in just a moment. It has personal connections to me and my family. In 1879, the first congregation, the first branch was organized. And then in 1885, the Spanish translation of the Book of Mormon becomes complete. It wasn't just selections, now it's the entire Book of Mormon. And then they move on to other tracts as well. So here's what I wanted to share with you about the first baptisms in Mexico. Now let me just assume not everyone is fluent in Spanish, and so I just want to translate this. This is a picture of Elder Laritz Nielsen. He went by the name of Louis Garf. He himself was born in Denmark. His parents were converts as well. He was among that first group of missionaries that were called into Mexico. He wrote this in his journal. On Sunday, the 20th of May, 1877, I baptized Jose Epifanio and Jesus. On Thursday, the 24th of May, I baptized Jose Severo Rodriguez and Maria Las Cruz Pasos. These are my great-great-great-grandparents on my mother's side. And then he says, Jose Vicente Parra, in a small village, a few leagues from the city of Hermosillo in the state of Sonora. These 5 baptisms were the first in all Mexico in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I would add to this as well, Jose Severo Rodriguez and Maria Luz de la Cruz Pasos were the first family. So the others were single men, but the first family, in other words, husband and wife, were actually my 3 great-grandparents and my children's 4th great-grandparents as well. So we're very proud of that particular heritage. Now, the missions then didn't last as long as missions do now, or even historically. I think when my father-in-law went out, his mission was 3 years, if I remember correctly. Often these missions only lasted a year. So Elder Jones returns then to settle in Lehigh. Various missionaries go back. In 1877, then Mesa is established. And then Snowflake, 1878, Pima, all the way down to the southeast of Arizona, St. John's up to northeast as well. I think I've got, here we go. So essentially, what Latter-day Saint settlements did is they settled along the dependable waterways. So these are the little Colorado settlements from Moenkopi up on the reservation, Tuba City. By the way, Tubac was also a convert of the church, and Tuba City was founded by Latter-day Saint missionaries and Navajos who were converts. So for some reason it became Tuba City over time, but his name was Tubac. He was actually trying to keep it. But so all the way from Tubac, all the way down to Alpine, if you're familiar with that part of the state. Also along the Salt River Valley, you see Nephi, Lehigh, this is Tempe, Mesa, this area as well. Lehigh, you might be able to read that. At one time it was known as Jonesville, right? Dan Webster Jones, also known as Utahville, also Bottom City. I'm not sure what that was about. It was at the bottom of Mesa, that's what that was about. And then also down here, the Gila settlements, right? So this is Wilcox and Pima and Thatcher as well. So this is essentially where the Latter-day Saints colonized in Arizona. I would say this as a historian. In looking over the history of Arizona, the Latter-day Saint settlements were really what settled the state of Arizona. They really were. I can't think of any other group, any other party that had settlements that were as large or as organized. Now this is one of the remarkable things about Latter-day Saint settlements is that basically with nothing that they could carry on their back or perhaps put in a wagon, once they established themselves in an area, they began planting. And they began harvesting, they began laying roads, they began building homes, and they actually made towns and cities. And this is one of the things that the Latter-day Saint settlers had, in particular, that were different than other settlements in Arizona as well. Oh, I forgot this last one, I apologize. This one's down to the very southeast of Arizona. This is now St. David, and some of those areas down along the San Pedro River as well. Now, the Latter-day Saint settlement of, this is not Arizona, but it's below Arizona, into Chihuahua and also Sonora are the colonies, all right? The colonies in Mexico. And the first colonies in Mexico then began from 1885. There are nearly 400 colonists from Utah that arrived in northern Mexico. 1895, the first state is created in Mexico in Colonia Juarez. Now what's interesting is in 1912, the revolution in Mexico breaks up in 1910. Pressure becomes so intense that many of the Americans living in the colonias had to leave, and then many of them went up to El Paso, but then returned afterwards. But this is the extent of all the colonies. Some of them are still there to this day. Many of them are no longer. But again, this is all part of this, and the reason why I bring this up is that my mother can tell you, again, having met many people from the colonias, myself as well. I grew up in Mesa. Many of the families that I knew, they came from the colonias, spoke better Spanish than I did. But the reason why I'm sharing this with you is that these were the families that often interacted and intersected with many Spanish-speaking congregations. They had a great love of Mexico, they had a great love of Mexicans and Mexican culture, and often felt more comfortable in the Spanish-speaking wards and branches than they did in the English-speaking ones, because that was their home. And they were driven from their home, and that was their history and their heritage. And so it's an interesting thing. I had the privilege, and I do mean privilege. If any of you know Wes Wagner, lives out in the West Valley. Wes Wagner served as state president for 10 years. I had the privilege of serving under him as a state high councilman. President Wagner, also from Mexico City, is blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and as I said before, he speaks Spanish better than I do, and he's more Mexican than I am. But again, this is this very interesting history that comes from this outreach and this expansion of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints into other areas of the American West, the American Southwest, into Mexico. And you have this very interesting commingling and co-mixing of populations and people as well. I mentioned this as well, but this becomes significant as well. So, as the revolution of 1910 breaks out, and many Americans leave, that also meant that many of the missionaries serving in Mexico were recalled and they had to come back to the United States. It was in 1915 that President Joseph F. Smith asked Ray L. Pratt, who himself was a missionary, one of the early missionaries to Mexico. He was then serving as the Mexican mission president, to stay in the United States and work with the Spanish-speaking populations in the United States, in the Western States mission. And then from that point forward, that's when we start to see the first full-time Spanish-speaking missionaries who were called to the Western States. So the hermanas that were here earlier, the Spanish-speaking sisters, they are the descendants, if you will, not literal, but you understand what I'm trying to say, that their history as far as being called a Spanish-speaking mission in the United States descends from this period. And it was all because of the revolution. And it was all because of the recognition that the church is growing among Spanish-speaking populations, and they needed to be ministered to and proselytized as well. And so that's when we start to see the opening up of the American West for Spanish-speaking people. And then Joseph F. Smith in 1918 authorizes a separate Spanish-speaking mission in the United States. Previously, it was simply an adjunct to the Western States mission. Then it became its own standalone mission as well. Now, this is what becomes very, very interesting to me. From that point going forward, the Latter-day Saint congregations began to hold worship sessions in Spanish. The earliest that I could find, and I believe that this is true, actually started here in Mesa. In 1919, the Spanish-American branch was organized. And then as we go forward, there was a Spanish-American branch organized in Salt Lake City, and then moving forward into other cities as well. Los Angeles, El Paso, Denver, Provo, even Buell, Idaho. In fact, speaking about Mesa and the growth of the church among Spanish-speaking members in Mesa, Mesa becomes a spiritual center point for Latinos, for all of Latin America, and I'll explain why. So I want you to just think about that for a moment. Mesa, this place here, becomes a spiritual center point for about 50 years for Latinos who have joined the church. Why? It's because of this temple, right over here. This temple was the first temple that begins holding worship services in Spanish. And from that point over, it grows. Now this picture is a picture of the, I'm sorry. Dedication, thank you so much. I'm glad you're here. This is a picture of the dedication of the Mesa Temple in 1927. 15 years later, church officials come down to Mesa to discuss with the then temple president the need for creating temple worship in Spanish. And then the first worship session in Spanish began in 1945 at this temple. And from there it goes on. In fact, in most temples of the adopted world today, you can access Spanish language worship. But it began here. Now, here's where things get interesting to me as well. As I said, the Mesa Temple becomes a center, a destination of worship for all of Latin American members of the church. So from 1945 to 1967, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they had an annual Lamanite conference here in Mesa. And this is where Spanish-speaking members, both from Latin America, but also locally. And for 56 years, Mesa becomes a significant site of religious devotion until the dedication of the Mexico City Temple in 1983. So this was a destination for many members of the church in Latin America would travel for days, sometimes weeks. They would come here, they would stay here to worship in the temple right there. And that wasn't all. How was that to be done? Well, the church also often opened up homes. Some of you remember this. I remember this quite well. The call would go out every year. We have a busload of saints coming up from Mexico or other places as well. Do you have a room that you can open up? And part of this, again, was what I would characterize as the knitting of hearts, the opportunity to serve members of the church who were Spanish-speaking, where saints in Mesa would open up their homes and their dinner tables and would help members of Spanish-speaking congregations coming into Mesa to worship. Often they would stay here for a week. I don't think it was much longer than that, but they would get as much as they can. This is a picture of the Mizona. Some of you might remember the Mizona. This was a structure that was utilized to house many saints as well, Spanish-speaking saints as they came up. Also, this is, in my day, it was known as the Tri-State Center. I think now it's called the Interstate Center, right? Again, it was another site where the conferences could be held, where people could stay as they came up to Mesa to worship as well. Now, Spanish-speaking outreach grows after this point for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Thousands attend the Lamanite conferences. Thousands of people attend, to the extent that by 1966 there were multiple sessions that are now being held in the Lamanite conferences. And it wasn't just once a year, it was twice a year, fall and spring, all here in Mesa. And then after 1973, this is nearly all temples, at least at that point, held Spanish-speaking worship sessions. So it all started here. It all grew out of that facility right across the street. And this is why this place becomes very, very significant for Spanish-speaking members of the Church of Jesus Christ. Now, this leads us then, as I've talked about Spanish language worship, and as I've talked about Spanish-speaking congregations, branches or wards as we call them in the church, there's always been the question, is language affinity congregations, our language affinity congregations, are they a good thing or not? And this is one that we wrestle with as a church. Do they help? Do they hinder? I'll share with you a couple things that I appreciate. Let me set, first of all, remember that the first Spanish-speaking congregation started here in Mesa in 1919. I want to just mention two things of historical context which makes the establishment of that congregation unique. First of all, in the interwar period, at the end of World War I, all the way up to World War II, so starting in the 1920s, going deep into the 1930s as well, there was something known as the Americanization movement. As you can appreciate, after World War II, this was the first mechanized war that the world had ever seen, mechanized. The first time that the world had ever seen destruction on a global scale into the millions. It is estimated that 14 million people lost their lives as a result of World War I. In the United States, there was a great political backlash to our involvement. Many people were asking, why were we involved? We had no stake in that conflict. What happened? There's a lot that goes on. But what grew out of that kind of backlash to our participation in World War I was something known as the Americanization movement. There was the belief that the United States had too many what was called hyphenated Americans. In other words, German Americans, Italian Americans, French Americans, Spanish-speaking Americans, hyphenated Americans. There was an effort to try and Americanize all of them. Now, how did they do that? Churches, schools, even civic organizations had Americanization classes at night. And what did they teach? They taught English fluency. What do they teach? American values, if you will. How to behave and look and act like an American. Because your ethnic identity is a hazard to the country. This was the view after the end of World War I, all the way up to the 1930s, there was a concerted effort to squash out your ethnic identity, your linguistic identity as well. Remember though, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints began Spanish-speaking organizations in 1919, and they continue to grow from that point. So this is one of the things that was different about the church, is they did not go along with this effort to Americanize members, but they recognized the value of language and culture and heritage, and created congregations to sustain that. The second one that I want to note as well is that, this is the age of legal and social segregation. It was in the laws, and it was in the social practices as well. And part of, as I mentioned before, this affinity that many Americans that had grown up in Mexico and that had this connection with the colonias, they also went to these Spanish-speaking congregations because this was home for them. Spanish was home for them. Mexican culture was home for them. It didn't matter that they were of Danish extraction or English extraction. They had grown up in the colonias, and they missed it, and they wanted to have that connection as well. And so you have these integrated congregations as well. And so again, this is what I find unique about the development of Spanish-speaking congregations in the church, is that it was not in an effort to Americanize, and it wasn't in an effort to segregate, because they were not segregated. The last thing I want to say about this is that Spanish-speaking congregations were not, you were not required to go to them if that was your primary language. You could go to English-speaking congregations. You chose to go to Spanish-speaking congregations because it made the most sense to you. So unlike segregation that said the law requires you to sit at one side of the room or sit at one side of the bus, in the church, no, you're welcome to go wherever you felt most comfortable. Now, I just want to share with you a few more slides and then we'll wrap it up. To this point about Americanization versus any other cultural identity, Paul H. Dunn, who served as a general authority, said this, and this characterizes many of the modern attitudes towards Spanish or language affinity congregations. We have many in the church, many, Tongan, Samoan, I mean the list goes on and on. Paul Dunn said this, do you think that when we get to the other side of the veil, in other words, when we die, the Lord is going to care whether you came from Tonga or New Zealand or Germany or America? No. That's why we call each other brothers and sisters. The color of skin, the culture we represent, the interests we have are all quite secondary to the concept of the eternal family. One more statement as well. This is from John H. Grover. Both of these church leaders have since passed on, but he said this as well. And I just now am recognizing no, I guess, he did say this. Sorry, I thought I recognized a typographical error. He said this, our prime role, speaking as a church, is not to teach people English or how to become American. Gospel principles don't vary from language to language. We declare Christ, not English. Our mission is not limited to culture. Again, just to show you that kind of the modern perception. Now I want to share with you, and this is we're getting towards the end, an observation from my good friend Ignacio Garcia, who is the Lemuel Red Professor of Western American History at Brigham Young University. And he wrote a memoir called Chicano While Mormon Activism, War and Keeping the Faith. And he had to say this about the value of these language affinity congregations, Spanish-speaking wards that he grew up in. He said this, my small Mormon congregation was both encompassing and demanding. There, I engaged in activities that were definitely out of my reach normally because of my stature. Ignacio was probably about this tall. Shyness, lack of good social skills, and my poverty. I became an actor in church plays, a second baseman in softball, a guard in basketball, an orator in the speech festivals, a Boy Scout leader, a translator for the church services, a primary teacher, a good dancer, a member of the choir, a part-time companion to the missionaries, and a teacher of doctrine. I honed my speaking and my social skills, learned to set goals, organized and conducted meetings, and acquired a deep and abiding love for my people. And I did all of this before I turned 18. Right? So again, I just shared that his experience about growing up in these language affinity congregations. They can nurture, they can encourage, they can provide opportunities for members that they might not have otherwise in much larger congregations as well. So with that, let me just share with you three slides of takeaways from my presentation. One, the Spanish-speaking heritage of Arizona. So Spanish was the lingua franca of the American West. In other words, it was the common tongue. So those of you who are Lord of the Rings fans, right? It was the common tongue that allowed people of different backgrounds to speak to each other. Many native communities didn't even speak the same language, but they communicated to each other in Spanish. So if we went back in time, the way that you could ensure that you could be understood was to speak Spanish. And it wasn't, again, just to Spanish speakers, but it was also the native communities. So first of all, Spanish was the lingua franca of the American West. Secondly, the territorial economy that we inherited was developed by the Mexican population. Mining, citrus industry, ranching, all of these were developed by the Mexican economy. That's part of the Hispanic heritage. In fact, I even go so far to say is if you think about many of our key industries now in Arizona, are they not reliant upon Spanish-speaking populations to keep them going? The hotel industry, the gardening industry, the construction industry, I mean, the list goes on and on and on. This is all part of our heritage of Arizona, this connection, this symbiotic relationship that we have. Many of the current towns that we have grew from Mexican population centers. St. John's, Arizona, at one time it was San Juan, and so forth and so on. This is part of the Spanish heritage of Arizona. The Spanish-speaking heritage of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, particularly in Arizona, again, the outreach to Spanish-speaking populations is intimately connected to the settlement of Arizona. And that many of the founders of Mesa, the McDonald's, the Robesons, the Jones, they were involved in that work. And Mesa, as I mentioned, it pioneered temple worship in Spanish, and Mesa was a spiritual epicenter for generations of Spanish-speaking Latter-day Saints for over 50 years. Here's the last thing, and this is the heritage we live with today. I think this is my last slide I'm going to share with you. I counted up 34 Spanish-speaking congregations within the state of Arizona now in 2022 as we speak. They are all descendants of that outreach, of that development, of the efforts of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to respect and to embrace and to allow the development of Spanish and Spanish language, but also history and heritage to develop. There's, incidentally, one French-speaking congregation as well in the Phoenix area. And if we were to zoom out, you would see them even larger. You can see them indicated up in Las Vegas, but certainly down in California and on into New Mexico as well. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your patience and your attention. And I think I just finished in less than an hour. So thank you so much. Doesn't have to be questions, but I'll be happy to answer a few questions if you have any. If I wasn't clear on anything, or even if I was factually incorrect, I'm happy to be correct. Any questions or comments? Yes, thank you.
First, I want to say